The immediate family sits in the front row, my daughter-in-law whispered at my husband's funeral, as if I were a distant guest instead of the woman who had spent 48 years by his side. I simply nodded and stepped aside. They treated me like I had nothing left. I never mentioned the $28 million. I'm Margaret Whitmore, 72 years old, and 3 days after losing my husband Daniel, I found myself standing in the foyer of St. Andrew's Church in Greenwich, Connecticut, feeling strangely invisible. The church was filled with white lilies, polished wood, and the low murmur of people sharing memories about a man they admired. Daniel had been respected wherever he went. He built a successful business, served on charitable boards, and somehow remembered everyone's birthday. People came from several states away just to pay their respects. Yet as I stood there holding the funeral program in trembling hands, I realized that not everyone was grieving the same loss. Some people were already thinking about what came next. My son Ryan stood near the front entrance greeting guests. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his expression carefully composed. Beside him was his wife, Vanessa, elegant in a black designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Every time someone approached, she tilted her head sympathetically and spoke in a soft voice that sounded caring until you listened closely. "Margaret is doing the best she can," she told one woman. "It's going to be difficult for her financially now." The woman glanced at me with immediate pity. I smiled politely. Financially? Daniel had been gone less than a week. Yet somehow Vanessa was already planting stories. Another guest squeezed my hand. "If you ever need help with the house, don't be afraid to ask." Again, that look. Sympathy. Concern. Assumptions. I thanked her and moved on. The sanctuary doors opened, and people slowly took their seats. That was when Vanessa approached me with that practiced smile. "Margaret," she said gently, "we've rearranged the seating. Ryan's family should probably sit in the first row." For a moment, I wasn't sure I understood her. Ryan's family? I looked toward the front and saw Ryan, Vanessa, and my grandchildren taking places where I had expected to sit. The place beside Daniel's casket, the seat reserved for a spouse, was gone. Vanessa gestured toward the third row. "We thought you might be more comfortable there." Comfortable. The word settled heavily in my chest. Around us, people watched discreetly, pretending not to notice. I could have objected. I could have reminded everyone that I was Daniel's widow. Instead, I nodded. "Of course," I said quietly. Vanessa smiled as if she had won something. I walked to the third row and sat alone. The funeral program crinkled slightly beneath my fingers. The pastor began speaking about Daniel's generosity, his integrity, his devotion to family. I listened carefully. Every word was true. Daniel had loved his family fiercely. What saddened me was knowing that some of the people he trusted most were already revealing parts of themselves he had always worried about. During the service, I noticed small things. Ryan never looked in my direction. Vanessa occasionally glanced back at me, checking whether I appeared upset. Several guests whispered to one another after speaking with her. By the time the final hymn began, I understood exactly what was happening. They wanted everyone to believe I was a fragile widow facing an uncertain future. They wanted sympathy directed toward me and confidence directed toward them. What they didn't know was that Daniel had prepared for this day far more carefully than anyone realized. And before the week was over, a sealed envelope waiting in a lawyer's office would change everything. The reception following the service was held in the fellowship hall beside the church, a place Daniel and I had visited countless times over the years for charity dinners, holiday gatherings, and community events. Everything looked familiar, yet nothing felt the same. Round tables covered in white linen filled the room. Coffee urns lined one wall. Trays of sandwiches and pastries sat untouched by many of the guests who seemed more interested in conversations than food. I accepted a cup of coffee and found a quiet seat near a window overlooking the church garden. The roses Daniel had helped plant years ago were beginning to bloom. For a moment, I focused on them instead of the people around me. Then I heard Vanessa speaking again. Her voice carried farther than she realized. "We are all worried about Margaret," she told a small group gathered around her. "She has never really handled the finances. Daniel took care of everything." Several people nodded sympathetically. One woman placed a hand over her heart. "That must be terrifying at her age." Vanessa sighed dramatically. "Ryan and I will do whatever we can. We may need to help her make some difficult decisions." Difficult decisions. I looked down at my coffee. Daniel had taught me many things during our marriage, but perhaps the most important lesson was learning when silence revealed more than questions ever could. So I listened. Throughout the afternoon, the same pattern repeated itself. Guests approached me with careful smiles and gentle concern. One man offered the business card of a financial planner. Another suggested a smaller condominium community nearby. A retired neighbor quietly mentioned that property taxes in our area had become expensive. None of them meant harm. They genuinely believed they were helping. The problem was that someone had given them a story that was not true. Ryan eventually joined me by the window. For a brief moment, I saw the little boy he used to be. The child who once brought me dandelions from the backyard and proudly announced they were flowers worthy of a queen. But the moment passed quickly. "How are you holding up, Mom?" he asked. "As well as can be expected," I replied. He nodded without meeting my eyes. "Vanessa and I have been talking. We think it might be a good idea to start planning ahead." There it was. Not even a week after his father's passing. "Planning what?" I asked softly. "Just practical things," he said. "The house is pretty large. The upkeep alone has to be expensive." I stirred my coffee slowly. "Your father and I managed it for 30 years. Things are different now," Ryan replied. "You should not have to worry about all that by yourself." I noticed he never asked what I wanted. He only spoke about what had already been decided. Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared beside him. Her smile was warm enough for anyone watching. "We only want what is best for you, Margaret." She rested a hand lightly on Ryan's arm. "You deserve to enjoy life without unnecessary stress." I smiled politely. "That is very thoughtful." Vanessa seemed almost disappointed by my calm reaction. Perhaps she expected resistance. Perhaps she wanted a scene. Instead, I finished my coffee and glanced once more toward the garden. The conversation drifted elsewhere, but I continued observing. Every whispered discussion stopped when I approached. Every mention of property, finances, or future plans seemed to circle back to me. By late afternoon, I understood something important. This was not grief guiding their behavior. It was assumption. They assumed Daniel had left behind confusion. They assumed I needed rescuing. Most of all, they assumed they knew everything. As guests began leaving, Attorney Charles Bennett entered the hall. He had managed legal matters for our family for nearly 2 decades. Our eyes met briefly across the room. He did not smile. He did not wave. He simply gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. Then he slipped a sealed envelope into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Something about that simple gesture caught my attention immediately. Hours later, after everyone had gone home and the church parking lot sat nearly empty beneath the fading Connecticut sunset, I found a voicemail waiting on my phone. It was from Charles. His message was short. "Margaret, there are matters Daniel instructed me to discuss with you personally. Please come to my office tomorrow morning. And bring no one with you." The next morning, I left my house before sunrise. The roads were still quiet as I drove toward downtown Greenwich, passing familiar storefronts that Daniel and I had visited for years. The sky was pale gray, and a thin layer of fog hung above the streets. Everything felt suspended between yesterday and whatever was waiting ahead. Charles Bennett's office occupied the top floor of a brick building overlooking the harbor. I arrived 10 minutes early, something Daniel always did and eventually taught me to do as well. The receptionist greeted me warmly and escorted me to a private conference room. The room was simple. A polished oak table. Leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Nothing dramatic. Yet I could not ignore the feeling that something important was about to happen. Charles entered carrying a thick folder and closed the door behind him. For several seconds he simply looked at me. His expression softened. "I am sorry for your loss, Margaret," he said quietly. "Daniel was one of the finest men I have ever known." I thanked him. Then I noticed the sealed envelope resting on top of the folder. My name was written across the front in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. Seeing it made my chest tighten. Charles slid the envelope toward me. "Your husband instructed me to give this to you personally. No one else was to be present." My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single folded letter. I immediately recognized the stationery. Daniel kept it in the drawer of his desk at home. I unfolded the page and began reading. "Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to tell you these things myself. First, know that I loved you every day of our marriage. Second, trust your instincts. If certain people begin showing you who they really are, believe them. Do not make excuses for them." I paused and swallowed hard. The words felt as though he were sitting beside me speaking directly into my ear. The letter continued. "There are matters regarding my estate that I intentionally kept private. Not because I did not trust you, but because secrecy was necessary. Charles knows everything. Listen carefully to him before making any decisions." I lowered the letter slowly. "Daniel was worried, wasn't he?" I asked. Charles folded his hands. "Yes." He did not hesitate. "For several years." That answer surprised me less than it should have. Memories began surfacing immediately. Vanessa asking unusual questions about company assets. Ryan becoming increasingly interested in financial matters he had previously ignored. Conversations that seemed innocent at the time now looked very different through a new lens. Charles opened the folder. "Before I explain anything, there is something you should know. Your husband made several significant changes to his financial structure over the last decade." He turned a page toward me. I stared at the numbers without fully processing them. There were investment accounts, trusts, property holdings, and business transactions. The figures were larger than I expected. Much larger. "Daniel believed that wealth often changes people's behavior," Charles continued. "He wanted to ensure that his legacy would remain protected regardless of circumstances." I sat silently as he explained document after document. Every few minutes another piece of a puzzle clicked into place. What shocked me most was not the amount of money involved. It was how carefully Daniel had planned everything. Nothing had been left to chance. Nothing had been left vulnerable. When Charles finally finished, he leaned back in his chair. "There is one more thing." He opened a separate file and slid it across the table. "Over the past 48 hours, I have received 3 calls from Ryan and 4 from Vanessa. They were all asking variations of the same question." I looked up. "What question?" Charles gave a small, knowing sigh. "They wanted to know when they could begin discussing control of the estate." For a moment, I simply stared at Charles. The room seemed unusually quiet. Outside the window, a few sailboats drifted across the harbor, their white sails moving slowly through the morning light. Life continued as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. "Control of the estate," I repeated softly. Charles nodded. "They never asked how you were doing. They never asked whether you needed assistance. Their questions were entirely focused on assets, authority, and timelines." I looked down at the folder resting on the table between us. A strange calm settled over me. Not because the truth was pleasant, but because uncertainty was finally disappearing. Daniel had always said that confusion was exhausting, but clarity, even painful clarity, allowed a person to move forward. "When did he begin worrying?" I asked. Charles leaned back slightly. Several years ago. Nothing dramatic at first. Small comments. Small observations. He noticed patterns. Patterns. That word unlocked memories I had ignored for too long. I remembered a Christmas dinner when Vanessa spent nearly an hour asking Daniel detailed questions about company ownership. At the time, I assumed she was simply curious. Then there was the family vacation in Vermont when Ryan suddenly became interested in estate planning. He had never shown interest before. Another memory surfaced. A charity gala 3 years earlier. Vanessa laughing politely while asking whether our house had appreciated in value. Daniel changed the subject almost immediately. I had forgotten that moment until now. He never told me, I said. He did not want you carrying the burden, Charles replied. He hoped he was wrong. That sounded exactly like Daniel. He always preferred giving people the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes more than they deserved. Charles opened another section of the file. There is something else you should understand. Daniel structured everything specifically to protect you. My eyes moved across pages filled with legal language. Trust agreements. Property documents. Investment records. Most of it was unfamiliar territory, but one fact became increasingly clear. Daniel had spent years building safeguards. Not against strangers. Against entitlement. Against manipulation. Against anyone who might see his passing as an opportunity rather than a loss. What happens now? I asked. Charles folded his hands. Now, nothing changes unless you decide it changes. The simplicity of his answer surprised me. For days, everyone around me had acted as though my future required immediate intervention. Sell the house. Downsize. Simplify. Relocate. Yet according to the documents in front of me, no such urgency existed. The pressure had not come from necessity. It had come from other people's assumptions. Charles slid another envelope across the table. Daniel left this one as well. He instructed me to wait until after our meeting. I carefully opened it. Inside was a short handwritten note. Margaret, if you are reading this, then you have probably started seeing things more clearly than before. Do not rush. Do not explain yourself. And most importantly, do not reveal everything immediately. Time has a way of exposing character. I smiled despite the ache in my chest. Even now, Daniel sounded exactly like himself. Patient. Observant. Practical. I folded the note and placed it back inside the envelope. He expected this, I said quietly. Not exactly, Charles answered. But he prepared for it. The meeting ended shortly before noon. As I walked through the lobby, I felt different than I had 24 hours earlier. Not stronger. Not happier. Simply more awake. The drive home took me along the shoreline. The water sparkled beneath the sunlight, and for the first time since the funeral, I lowered the car window. Fresh air filled the cabin. When I pulled into my driveway, another surprise was waiting. Ryan's SUV sat parked beside the garage. Vanessa stood on the front porch holding a folder against her chest. Through the windshield, I watched them for several seconds before stepping out of the car. They were smiling. The kind of smiles people wear when they have already made plans without asking permission. And somehow, before either of them spoke a single word, I knew they had come to discuss my future. Vanessa stepped forward before I even reached the porch. Margaret, there you are, she said brightly, as though we had planned a pleasant afternoon together. Ryan stood beside her holding a cardboard tray with 3 coffees. The gesture might have seemed thoughtful to anyone passing by. To me, it felt rehearsed. We brought you lunch, Ryan said. You should not be alone right now. I unlocked the front door and invited them inside. The house felt different without Daniel. Every room carried traces of him. His reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair. A gardening magazine remained folded on the kitchen counter where he had left it days before his passing. Vanessa glanced around the room with an expression I could not quite read. It was not sadness. It was evaluation. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where birthdays had been celebrated, report cards had been admired, and countless family dinners had taken place. Ryan placed a folder in front of me. We have been thinking about a few things, he began carefully. I looked at the folder but did not open it. Such as? Vanessa leaned forward. Only practical matters. We are worried about you. There was that phrase again. Worried about you. It seemed to be everyone's favorite sentence lately. The house is large, she continued. The maintenance alone must be overwhelming. I folded my hands quietly and listened. There are some wonderful retirement communities nearby, she said. Beautiful places. Social activities. Security. Less responsibility. Ryan nodded in agreement. We just want to make sure you are taken care of. I noticed neither of them asked whether I wanted to leave my home. The assumption had already been made. Vanessa opened the folder and slid several brochures across the table. Smiling retirees played golf beneath sunny skies. Couples walked along landscaped paths. Elegant dining rooms appeared on glossy pages. Everything looked carefully designed to sell comfort. You have really been planning this, I said. Vanessa smiled. Only because we care. For a moment, nobody spoke. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. I remembered something Daniel once told me during a business dispute many years earlier. He said that when people wanted something from you, they often talked the most during moments when silence would reveal too much. Looking back now, I realized how often his advice proved true. Ryan cleared his throat. Mom, there is another thing. He exchanged a glance with Vanessa. The property market is very strong right now. There it was. The real conversation had finally arrived. This house could sell quickly, he continued. You would not have to deal with the burden anymore. I looked around the kitchen. Burden. That word felt strange attached to a place filled with nearly 5 decades of memories. Daniel teaching Ryan how to ride a bicycle in the driveway. Christmas mornings beside the fireplace. Summer evenings on the back porch. Burden was not the word I would have chosen. I see, I said softly. Vanessa's smile widened slightly. She probably mistook my calmness for agreement. There is no rush, she said. But we thought it would be smart to begin planning. The conversation continued for another hour. They discussed logistics, possibilities, and future arrangements. Throughout it all, I mostly listened. The more they spoke, the more confident they became. By the time they stood to leave, they seemed convinced that everything was progressing exactly as they hoped. At the front door, Ryan hugged me briefly. We are only trying to help, he said. I know, I replied. After they drove away, I remained standing on the porch, watching their vehicle disappear down the street. Then I returned inside and placed Daniel's letter on the kitchen table beside the brochures. The contrast made me smile sadly. One side contained plans created after less than a week of widowhood. The other contained wisdom prepared years in advance. As evening settled over the house, my phone buzzed with a new message from Charles Bennett. The meeting with the trustees had been scheduled for Friday morning. And according to the message, Ryan and Vanessa had already requested to attend. Friday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather for early spring. I woke before dawn and sat alone on the back porch with a cup of coffee, listening to birds move through the maple trees that lined the property. Daniel used to enjoy mornings like that. Quiet. Unhurried. The kind of moments most people overlook while chasing something else. I found myself thinking about him often that week, not only because I missed him, but because his presence seemed woven into every decision I now faced. At 9 o'clock, I arrived at Charles Bennett's office. The receptionist escorted me to a larger conference room than before. A long table occupied the center of the room. Several leather chairs had already been arranged. Through the windows, I could see the harbor sparkling beneath the sunlight. Everything appeared calm. Yet beneath that calm, I sensed movement. Preparation. Expectation. Charles entered carrying several folders. "Good morning, Margaret," he said. "The trustees will arrive shortly." I nodded and took a seat. "And Ryan?" I asked. Charles glanced at his watch. He confirmed. "Attendance. Vanessa as well." There was a pause before he added, "They seemed very eager." Eager. That was one way to describe it. 10 minutes later, the conference room door opened. Ryan entered first, wearing a navy suit. Vanessa followed beside him carrying a leather notebook and a confident smile. Both greeted me warmly, almost enthusiastically. The change in energy was impossible to miss. Gone was the careful sympathy from the funeral. Gone were the concerned conversations about my well-being. Today they appeared focused. Purposeful. Vanessa sat directly across from me and arranged her papers neatly on the table. "We are glad everyone could meet," she said. "It is important to get clarity moving forward." Charles acknowledged the statement without commenting. More people arrived over the next few minutes. Financial advisors. Trustees. Professionals Daniel had trusted for years. Once everyone was seated, the meeting began. I remained quiet. Ryan spoke several times. Vanessa spoke even more. They asked questions about timelines, responsibilities, management structures, and future planning. Listening to them felt strangely educational. The more they talked, the more they revealed what occupied their thoughts. Not grief. Not family. Not memories. Control. At one point, Vanessa smiled toward me. "We all want what is best for Margaret," she said. Managing significant assets can become overwhelming at her age. A few heads turned in my direction. I noticed Charles writing something on a notepad. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to settle. Daniel used to do the same thing in business meetings. People often revealed more during uncomfortable silence than they intended. Eventually, Charles closed the folder in front of him. "There seems to be some confusion," he said calmly. Ryan straightened in his chair. Vanessa's smile remained fixed. Charles continued. "Several assumptions have been made regarding authority, management, and decision-making. Before we proceed further, it is important that everyone understands the actual structure established by Daniel Whitmore." The room became noticeably quieter. I folded my hands and watched. Across the table, Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Ryan looked attentive. Neither realized that the conversation they expected was about to become something entirely different. Charles reached for a thick document resting beside him. The trustees exchanged brief glances. Then he opened the file and said the words that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. "Before discussing any future plans, we need to review the trust that Daniel created and funded over many years. The trust currently holds assets valued at approximately $28 million. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The number seemed to settle over the room like a sudden change in weather. $28 million. I watched Ryan blink twice as though he had misheard. Vanessa remained perfectly still, but her expression changed in a way she could not completely hide. The confidence that had carried her through the meeting moments earlier seemed to falter. Charles continued calmly. "The trust includes investment portfolios, commercial holdings, private accounts, and several long-term assets accumulated over many years." He spoke with the steady voice of a man reading facts rather than delivering surprises. Around the table, the trustees remained composed. Clearly, none of this was new information to them. It was only new to Ryan and Vanessa. "$28 million? Ryan finally asked. "Dad never mentioned anything like that." Charles nodded. "That was intentional." Vanessa leaned forward. And how is the trust structured? She asked quickly. The question came so fast that even Ryan glanced toward her. Charles opened another section of the file. The structure is quite clear. Daniel established Margaret Whitmore as the primary beneficiary and decision-maker. All major authority remains exclusively with her. Silence returned. This time it lasted longer. I folded my hands in my lap and looked out toward the harbor. Sailboats still drifted across the water. The world outside remained unchanged while the atmosphere inside the room shifted completely. Vanessa attempted a smile. Well, of course Margaret should be comfortable. The sentence sounded different now. Less certain. Less generous. Charles continued reading. Additionally, the trust contains protective provisions. Any attempt to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence financial decisions may result in restricted access to future distributions. One of the trustees adjusted his glasses. Another quietly reviewed a document in front of him. Ryan stared at the table. Vanessa's smile disappeared altogether. I remembered Daniel's note. Time has a way of exposing character. Sitting there, I understood exactly what he meant. Nobody had forced anyone to reveal themselves. They had done it willingly. Through assumptions. Through impatience. Through greed disguised as concern. I do not understand, Ryan finally said. You are saying Mom controls everything? Charles looked directly at him. I am saying your father spent years ensuring your mother would never depend on anyone else's approval, permission, or guidance regarding her future. The room became quiet once more. I noticed Vanessa glance toward the brochures still sticking out of her notebook. The retirement communities. The downsizing plans. The conversations about selling my home. Suddenly those discussions seemed very far away. Charles closed one folder and opened another. There is also the matter of the residence. Ryan looked up immediately. The house? Yes, Charles replied. The property is protected separately and cannot be sold, transferred, or managed without Margaret's direct authorization. Vanessa shifted in her chair. Naturally, she said. Nobody was suggesting otherwise. The statement hung awkwardly in the room. We all knew better. Charles simply continued. Your father left detailed instructions regarding his intentions. He wanted Margaret to remain entirely free to choose her own path without pressure from family members or outside parties. For the first time since the meeting began, Ryan looked directly at me. There was confusion in his eyes. Perhaps embarrassment as well. Mom, he said quietly, why did you never tell us? I thought about that question carefully. Then I answered honestly. Because nobody asked about me. Everyone was too busy discussing my future. No one responded. The trustees exchanged brief glances. Charles closed the final folder. There is one remaining document, he said. And I believe Daniel intended it to be read today. Charles removed a sealed document from the final folder and placed it carefully on the table. The room was completely silent. Even the faint sounds from the harbor outside seemed distant. I recognized the envelope immediately. It matched the stationery Daniel had always used for personal letters. My heart tightened as Charles opened it and unfolded several pages. This document contains a personal statement from Daniel Whitmore, he said. He instructed that it be read only after the trust structure had been fully explained. Ryan shifted slightly in his chair. Vanessa sat perfectly still. Charles began reading. To my family, if you are hearing these words, then I am no longer able to speak them myself. First, I want Margaret to know that she was the greatest blessing of my life. Every success I achieved was built beside her, not apart from her. I lowered my eyes toward the table. For a moment, I could almost hear Daniel's voice. Charles continued. Second, I ask everyone present to remember something important. Wealth is not a reward. It is not proof of character. If anything, it often reveals character. Nobody moved. Over the years, I observed many conversations about money, property, inheritance, and future expectations. Some of those conversations concerned me. That is why I created safeguards. Not because I wished to punish anyone, but because I wished to protect Margaret from pressure during the most vulnerable chapter of her life. The words settled heavily across the room. Ryan stared at the document. Vanessa's expression remained composed, but her eyes no longer carried the confidence they once had. Charles turned the page. If Margaret chooses to remain in our home, support her. If she chooses to travel, support her. If she chooses to make decisions you do not understand, respect them. The purpose of my estate is to provide her freedom, not to create expectations for others. One of the trustees quietly cleared his throat. Another looked down at his notes. Charles continued reading. I have spent enough years in business to know that entitlement often disguises itself as concern. Advice can become pressure. Help can become control. I ask everyone to examine their intentions honestly. The room felt smaller somehow. More honest. Ryan slowly lowered his gaze. For the first time since the funeral, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. When Charles finished the final paragraph, he folded the document and returned it to the folder. No dramatic announcement followed. No argument erupted. The truth required no additional decoration. It was complete on its own. Several seconds passed before Ryan finally spoke. Dad really thought all of this was necessary? His voice sounded quieter than before. Charles answered carefully. Your father hoped it would never become necessary. That is different. Ryan nodded slowly. Across the table, Vanessa opened her notebook and then closed it again without writing anything. The brochures. The plans. The assumptions. All of it suddenly seemed irrelevant. One trustee stood and gathered his papers. The others followed. The formal portion of the meeting had ended. Yet before anyone left, Charles turned toward me. Margaret, he said, there is one final matter requiring your decision. Every eye shifted in my direction. The trust grants you complete authority over future distributions and family participation. You may leave everything exactly as Daniel structured it. You may modify portions of it. Or you may choose another path entirely. Ryan looked at me. Vanessa looked at me. For days they had been making plans for my future. Now, for the first time, they understood that the future belonged entirely to me. I considered the question carefully. Then I smiled. Not because I felt victorious. Not because I wanted revenge. But because Daniel had given me something far more valuable than money. He had given me clarity. I will make my decision later, I said calmly. After everyone has had time to reflect. No one argued. No one objected. As the meeting ended and people began leaving the conference room, I noticed something that had been missing ever since the funeral. For the first time, nobody looked at me with pity. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Not because everything had been resolved, but because the truth had finally entered the room and left very little space for pretending. Ryan called several times during the first week. Our conversations were polite, careful, almost unfamiliar. For the first time in years, he seemed uncertain of what to say. Vanessa never called directly. Instead, she sent brief messages asking how I was doing or whether I needed anything. I read them all. I answered some. I ignored others. Meanwhile, life continued. The roses in the garden opened fully. The weather grew warmer. Every morning I carried my coffee onto the back porch and watched the sunlight move across the lawn. Grief remained with me. Money had never changed that. Wealth could solve many problems, but it could not fill the empty chair across from me at dinner. It could not replace Daniel's voice. It could not bring back 48 years of shared routines. Yet what it did provide was freedom. Freedom from fear. Freedom from dependence. Freedom to make decisions without pressure. One afternoon, about a month after the meeting, I invited Ryan to lunch. Just Ryan. No attorneys. No trustees. No Vanessa. We met at a small waterfront restaurant Daniel and I used to enjoy. For a while we spoke about ordinary things. The grandchildren. The weather. Work. Eventually Ryan set down his fork and looked at me. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. I did not answer immediately. "For what?" He stared out toward the water. "For assuming things. For treating you like you needed permission to make decisions. For not listening." The honesty surprised me. Not because I doubted he was capable of it, but because it had been absent for so long. "Your father always worried about that," I said gently. "Worried about what?" "People seeing assets instead of people." Ryan lowered his eyes. "I think I understand that now." Maybe he did. Maybe he was still learning. Either way, it was a beginning. A few days later, I made my final decision regarding the trust. I left Daniel's structure largely unchanged. The safeguards remained exactly where he had placed them. Future benefits would still exist. For the family, but only under the conditions he established. Accountability remained. Respect remained. Consequences remained. When Charles reviewed the documents, he smiled. "This sounds very much like something Daniel would have approved." "Good," I replied. That was the goal. Months passed. I traveled more than I had in years. I visited coastal towns in Maine. I spent time with old friends. I supported several charities that mattered deeply to Daniel. Most importantly, I stopped living according to other people's expectations. One evening, nearly a year after the funeral, I stood in my garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and amber. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and blooming roses. For the first time in a very long while, I felt peaceful. Not because I had won something. Not because anyone had lost something. But because the truth had revealed exactly what it needed to reveal. People often assume that money changes everything. In my experience, it simply magnifies what was already there. Generosity becomes more visible. Gratitude becomes more visible. So does entitlement. So does greed. Daniel understood that long before I did. As I looked across the yard we had built together, I thought about the funeral, the pitying looks, the whispered assumptions, and the plans people made for a future they believed belonged to them. I had never argued. I had never demanded respect. I had never announced a number or waved a bank statement. I simply listened. I watched. And eventually, everyone showed me exactly who they were. They thought I was powerless because I stayed quiet. What they never understood was that silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is wisdom waiting for the truth to finish speaking.